In a story where trust is everything, betrayal cuts the deepest. She believed in love, in loyalty, in a future built side by side. But while she was giving her all, the truth was quietly unfolding behind her back. Lies hidden in plain sight. Secrets waiting for the right moment to destroy everything. And when that moment comes, it doesn't just break her, it awakens her.
Are you ready for tonight?
Because from the ashes of betrayal rises a woman stronger than ever, ready to reclaim her life, her power, and her destiny. This isn't just heartbreak, this is transformation. The lesson? Not everyone deserves your trust, but every betrayal teaches you your true worth. Sometimes, the pain you go through becomes the strength you never knew you had. And walking away isn't the end, it's the beginning of something greater. If this story inspired you, don't forget to like, share, and support the channel. Your support gives us the motivation to bring you more powerful stories like this. Thanks for watching.
She was pronounced dead in a Miami trauma center at 34 years old. They lifted 3 infants from her body, 2 boys, 1 girl. All of them breathing, all of them wailing, while their mother's heart monitor showed a flat line. In the brightly lit corridor, her husband Julian was staring at his tablet. He wasn't sending prayers. He was approving final invoices with his mistress on a secure server. 4 days later, that mistress was arranging her shoes in the dead woman's walk-in closet. 2 weeks later, she was hosting a dinner party at the Star Island estate. She posted a selfie from the dead woman's rooftop architectural studio with the caption, "Designing Our Future." She was convinced she had engineered the perfect life, but the dead woman was a world-renowned architect, a planner who accounted for every variable. In the final encrypted blueprints for their smart home, she had embedded a plan within the plan, a key coded into the foundation, a final sequence, a structural narrative that began with a single annotation. For my mother, if you're seeing this, the project isn't finished. And when that blueprint was finally activated, it didn't just bankrupt her husband's real estate empire. It revealed a deception so profound that the mistress, the investors, the lawyers, and every person in that house realized they had been merely fixtures in a dead woman's meticulously designed retribution. This is the story of a mother who built a future for her children from beyond the grave, and it will reshape everything you think you know about betrayal, love, and the unbreakable strength of a woman who refuses to be demolished. We're losing her. Get the crash cart now! Dr. Ramirez's voice cut through the chaos of the operating room, calm, precise, but his forehead was beaded with sweat. He had delivered over 4,000 babies in his career. He had never lost a mother, not one, and he swore tonight wouldn't be the first. The monitors screamed a single, relentless tone. It was the sound of a blueprint being torn in half, a sound that would haunt his dreams for years. The team moved in a blur of surgical green, a well-oiled machine of gloved hands and urgent commands. One surgeon fought the hemorrhage, a nurse pushed bags of blood into the IV, another was calling out vitals to the anesthesiologist. Catherine Croft lay on the table, 34 years old, 34 weeks pregnant with triplets. Strands of dark hair were plastered to her pale skin, and her lips had turned a faint shade of blue. Her fingers were curled tightly around a slim silver object, the drafting pencil she had used to design her first award-winning skyscraper. 3 new structures, she had once joked to him, were about to become her magnum opus. Her eyelids fluttered, her gaze finding Dr. Ramirez's. She tried to form a word, her voice a fragile whisper, nearly swallowed by the electronic alarms. "Tell them," she breathed. "The design, it was all for them." Then her eyes slid shut. The crash cart clattered into the room. Dr. Ramirez went to work. He began compressions, shouting for the paddles, injecting epinephrine straight into her central line. He fought for 13 minutes that stretched into an eternity. 13 minutes while his team performed the emergency C-section, delivering 3 babies. Leo was first, then Max, and finally Isabella. All 3 were alive. All 3 were crying, their first breaths filling the room with a raw, defiant chorus. Their mother was not alive. Their mother was not crying. Their mother was gone. Dr. Ramirez stopped, pulling off his bloody gloves. He glanced at the clock on the wall. 10:36 p.m. He would never forget that time. Time of death, he said, his voice catching on the last word. 10:36 p.m. The room fell quiet. Not silent. The machines still beeped. The babies still cried. But the tension broke. It was the crushing stillness that arrives when a final, unchangeable fact settles over a room. In the hallway, Julian Croft was leaning against the wall. He wasn't wringing his hands. He wasn't pacing. He was focused on his tablet, the screen's cold light illuminating his handsome features. He was swiping through schematics, his thumb moving with the cool efficiency of a developer reviewing a punch list. A nurse emerged, her eyes puffy above her surgical mask. She looked at Julian. She said his name. He didn't look up. She said it again, more firmly. He raised his index finger, the universal gesture for asterisk, give me a second asterisk. She said his name a third time. Mr. Croft, I need you to come with me, now. He glanced up, his expression a perfect blank. He powered down his tablet, slipped it into his briefcase, and followed her. He never once asked if anything was wrong. He didn't rush, he simply walked. The NICU staff had the triplets settled into their easelettes. 3 small transparent boxes, 3 tiny forms swaddled in hospital blankets. Leo in blue, Max in green, Isabella in yellow. They were so fragile, so small, but their chests were rising and falling. Fighters, all of them, just like their mother. Julian stood before the easelettes, his gaze moving from one to the next as if he were inspecting units in a new development. He turned to the nurse. "What's their viability outlook?" he asked. The nurse, startled by the cold term, just blinked and nodded. "Good," he replied. "That's good." He didn't ask about Catherine, not at first, not until Dr. Ramirez led him into a private consultation room, not until the doctor stood before him and spoke the words. Even then, his reaction was one of pure logistical assessment. He shut his eyes, pinched the bridge of his nose, and let out a long, controlled breath, like a man absorbing an unavoidable construction delay. "Was it the preeclampsia?" he asked. Dr. Ramirez confirmed it was. "We did everything we could. The event was sudden, massive. The hemorrhaging was catastrophic. I am so terribly sorry, Julian." He gave a single sharp nod. He ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair. "But the assets are secure," he stated, then quickly corrected himself. "The children, they're viable." "Okay," Julian said, exhaling again. "Okay, I have to make some arrangements." He turned and walked back into the hall. He took out his phone. He made one call. It was picked up on the second ring. Not the call of a man fumbling through his contacts in grief, but of someone who had the number ready. "It's done," he said into the phone. "She's gone. Come to the estate. I'll send the gate code when I'm clear." He ended the call and stood for a moment, the sterile fluorescent lights of the hospital gleaming on the polished linoleum. The air smelled of disinfectant and filtered air. He put his phone away, adjusted the cuffs of his shirt, and walked back toward the NICU. For the first time that night, he composed his face into the perfect mask of a devastated husband. Margaret arrived at 11:45 that night. She had driven for 4 hours from her home in Naples, navigating through a thick veil of coastal fog. Her daughter had called hours before, her water breaking 6 weeks early. Margaret had tossed an overnight bag into her car and just driven. No radio, no coffee stops, no food. Just 4 hours of silence, the rhythmic swoosh of the windshield wipers, and a single prayer repeating in her head. She walked onto the maternity floor expecting to finally meet her grandchildren. She was 63 years old, with salt and pepper hair and the analytical eyes of someone who had spent a lifetime spotting structural weaknesses. She had raised her daughter alone after her husband's death, working as a civil engineer for 30 years. She had managed every crisis life could throw at her. She was ready for this. She was ready to be a grandmother. A hospital chaplain was standing near the nurse's station. Margaret stopped. Her gaze shifted from the chaplain's gentle face to the somber nurse beside him. She knew, before a single word was spoken, she knew An engineer always knows when a structure is about to fail. No, she whispered. The word was just air. The chaplain moved toward her, his voice low, reciting the rehearsed lines people use to narrate the collapse of someone's world. Margaret didn't hear the sentences. She heard a rushing in her ears, the low buzz of the overhead lights, and the faint cry of a newborn from a room down the corridor. Her grandchild. One of her grandchildren, crying for a mother who would never come. Margaret's legs buckled, not into a conveniently placed chair. Right there in the middle of the hallway, she sank to the sterile floor and covered her face with her hands. And the sound that escaped her was not a word, not a cry, but something far more primal. It was a noise that comes from the bedrock of a mother's soul, where every foundation is laid. It was the sound of a heart being ripped from its moorings. A nurse knelt beside her, another offered water. The chaplain simply stood by, waiting. Julian appeared at the end of the hall. He strode over to Margaret, knelt down, and placed a hand on her shoulder. "I'm so sorry, Margaret," he said, his voice impossibly smooth. "She fought so hard. The babies are okay. All three of them. She would want us to be strong for them." Margaret looked up, her vision swimming with tears and a grief so total it felt like a seismic event. She looked at her son-in-law, and somewhere deep in her mind, a lifetime of analyzing stress points, of seeing the hairline fracture in a faulty design, took over. A warning signal flared. She nodded, saying nothing. She let the nurses help her to her feet. She wiped her eyes on the sleeve of her jacket. She asked to see the babies. The neonatal unit was hushed and warm, the soft chiming of the monitors creating a delicate electronic lullaby. Eleanor paused at Leo's esalet first. The child was achingly small, 4 pounds, 6 ounces. A fine down of dark hair dusted his scalp, and he had Julian's jawline, a miniature, resolute angle already defined. An attendant with kind eyes helped Eleanor, whose own hands trembled, to guide them into the ports of the incubator. She gently stroked the top of Thea's hand with her littlest finger. Thea's tiny fingers instinctively curled around hers. A reflex she knew, nothing more, but it felt like a message. It felt like Clara, reaching out through her daughter, whispering, "I'm still here, Mom. I'm with you." Eleanor stayed for what felt like hours. She moved between them, Leo and Thea. She memorized their faces, the fragile rise and fall of their chests, the way Leo's mouth formed a perfect O in his sleep, the way Thea would occasionally twitch a smile at some secret dream world amusement. She remained until a charge nurse gently insisted she needed to rest. She did not rest. She returned to the private maternity suite overlooking the San Francisco Bay, collapsed into a leather armchair, and stared as the city's lights dissolved into a blur. After a while, she got up to get a glass of water from the counter. The suite's main window offered a bird's-eye view of the hospital's executive drop-off zone. Under the cold, white glare of the security lamps, she saw Julian. He was stepping out of his sleek silver sedan, but he was not by himself. He was accompanied by a woman, striking and poised, with dark hair swept into a severe, elegant knot and a cashmere coat that spoke of quiet wealth. The woman's hand lingered on his forearm for a beat too long, a gesture that conveyed partnership, not sympathy. He wasn't recoiling from her touch. He wasn't weeping. Eleanor stood frozen before the floor-to-ceiling window of the luxury apartment, the heavy crystal tumbler slowly cracking in her grip. Iced tea spilled, shockingly cold against her skin, seeping into the cuff of her blouse. She hardly felt it. She watched until the woman got into a separate black car, until Julian smoothed the collar of his $1,000 jacket and walked back toward the hospital entrance. Eleanor sank onto the suede sofa. She placed the fractured glass on the polished stone of the end table. She locked her hands together, squeezing until the blood drained from her knuckles. She did not rest at all that night, but she did start making plans. The memorial was on a Friday. White orchids, stark and elegant, were arranged in towering sculptures throughout the atrium of the De Young Museum. 300 people occupied the rows of sleek chairs. There was no casket. Eleanor had insisted. She would not allow 300 acquaintances to gaze at a box while pretending her daughter was inside, murmuring about the awful tragedy as if it were some form of high society entertainment. The atrium was filled with the scent of orchids and stone and the clashing, expensive perfumes of the city's tech elite, all assembled in one grand cavernous hall. Mid-afternoon sun streamed through the glass ceiling, casting hard, uncompromising shadows across the copper facade. It was austere, breathtaking, and utterly indifferent. The light did not care one bit that Clara Vance was gone. Julian was at the lectern. He wore a custom charcoal suit, not black, no tie. His hair was perfectly styled. His eyes were red-rimmed. He spoke without notes, his voice carrying the smooth, confident rhythm of a keynote address. "Clara was my source code," he started, his voice catching with practiced perfection on the word code. Just for a moment, just enough to capture their full attention. 300 guests leaned in. 300 hearts broke for him. She was the most creative, most compassionate, most brilliant mind I will ever have the honor of knowing, he went on. She invested her entire being into our life, into our family. She was building our future, our 2 children, and she protected them with every ounce of her strength. That was Clara, an architect of kindness, a mother, the designer of my entire world. He paused, pressing his lips together in a masterful display of restraint. He glanced down. When he looked up again, a single, flawless tear cut a path down his cheek. "I don't know how to build a world without her," he concluded, "but I must, for Leo, for Thea, for the beautiful life we were designing together." He moved away from the lectern. The audience started to clap, a soft, respectful wave of applause. A number of people got to their feet, a standing ovation for an impeccable performance of grief. Eleanor remained in her seat in the front row. She did not stand. She did not clap. She sat with her spine perfectly straight, her hands knotted in her lap, her gaze fixed on a sculpture far beyond the stage. She was thinking about the airport goodbye, about the woman with the elegant knot of hair murmuring into her son-in-law's ear just hours after her daughter's life had ended. Marcus sat beside her, Clara's older brother, 38, with the sharp, focused energy of a man who'd spent 15 years as an investigative journalist. He had barely said 10 words since flying in from Washington, D.C. Not one. He just sat, his eyes locked on Julian, the muscles in his jaw tight as coiled wire. "This is a product launch," Eleanor whispered, her voice so quiet only Marcus could hear. "He's delivering a pitch. Your sister messaged me 2 weeks ago, panicked," Marcus answered in a low voice. "She said Julian's new AI was dangerously unpredictable." She hung up before she could explain. Marcus went quiet, but on his knee, his large, steady hands slowly curled into fists. Near the rear of the atrium, a woman was scanning the room with the cool confidence of a C-suite executive, Isabel Rossi, a chief operating officer for the deceased's husband. She wore a tailored navy dress that was both understated and powerfully expensive. Her lipstick was a rich, deep crimson, not a somber, tasteful nude, but a bold boardroom shade, the kind of color that asserts its presence, the kind of color that says, "I am here and I am in charge." She was in the second to last row. She did not shed a tear. She observed Julian's performance with an unreadable look. Was it support or was it assessment? The gaze of a partner overseeing a critical transition of power. After the memorial, the guests were directed to a reception at a minimalist gallery in the Soma district. No sad casseroles here, only staff carrying trays of champagne and bites of avocado toast. Eleanor stood next to a massive abstract painting, accepting hollow condolences, air kisses, and the same worn-out phrases. "She's in a better place now. The babies have a guardian angel. You need to be strong for them. Time heals all wounds." Time doesn't heal, Eleanor thought. It just carves you out, making more space for the pain. Chloe, Clara's best friend from architecture school, found her near the open bar. 36, with a cascade of dark curls and eyes puffy from 4 days of continuous crying. "Elle," Chloe said, clutching Eleanor's elbow, "I have to tell you something. I talked to Clara about a month ago. She said something odd. She said if anything happened to her, I needed to check the model for her Sky Garden project. She said the foundation contains the failsafe. She made me repeat it back to her. She was completely serious." Eleanor just stared at Chloe. The low thrum of the gallery, the clinking of glasses, the tech world chatter, it all receded into a distant buzz. "The model," Eleanor said. Chloe nodded. "The foundation." She meant it. Eleanor processed the words. She didn't ask for more information. She didn't let her expression reveal anything. She simply nodded, squeezed Chloe's arm, and said, "Thank you." She had learned one thing in her 63 years of life. When you realize you're playing a game of chess, you do not, under any circumstances, reveal your next move to your opponent. And she could feel his eyes on her. Julian's mother, Beatrice Vance, was on the other side of the room. 68, with impeccably styled gray hair and her signature minimalist gold necklace. She'd not spoken a single word of sympathy to Eleanor since she arrived at the hospital. Not one. She hadn't even asked about the twins. She stood with her circle of venture capitalists, watching Eleanor like a hawk observing a threat, her eyes gleaming with cold, strategic calculation. 3 days after the memorial, Eleanor started a log. Julian was never present for the 2 a.m. feedings, not once. The new night nurse took care of everything. The nurse, a woman named Anya, was 27. A quick search revealed she was employed by an exclusive childcare agency, an agency that Beatrice Vance's firm had heavily invested in. Julian had hired her less than 48 hours after Clara was gone. He had not consulted Eleanor. He had not asked anyone. In that same time frame, Julian had a team come to the house to systematically wipe Clara's home office servers. He had already canceled Clara's subscriptions to architectural design journals. Julian had a team of designers come to their Gold Coast brownstone and box up Amelia's study, every first edition, every architectural folio, every volume of poetry, without consulting Eleanor, without asking her brother, without leaving a single book for his own children. Eleanor watched in silence. She documented it all on a small, encrypted tablet her daughter had insisted she use. Names, dates, inventory numbers. On the 3rd day after they'd finished, Eleanor saw it lying on the marble kitchen island. She was checking the security feed from the twins' nursery, the 2 bassinets glowing softly on her screen. It was an invoice, left out with careless arrogance. Initial design consultation and asset relocation. Alinea Tower penthouse. The project lead was listed as Chloe Valmont. Eleanor's breath caught. She felt a cold dread creep up her spine as she heard Julian's voice from his office down the hall, speaking on the phone. "It's nearly settled, Chloe. The old collections are in storage. The contracts for the penthouse are ready for signature. Our new beginning is just days away." Eleanor stood frozen, her heart a heavy, painful drum against her ribs. The next morning, a notification popped up on the family's shared digital calendar on the smart display by the coffee maker. It wasn't hidden among other appointments. It stood alone, stark and absolute. Final walkthrough, Alinea Tower penthouse. Scheduled for the following Tuesday. She read the words 4 times. She brewed herself a cup of black tea, foregoing the milk and sugar. She walked to the bay window and stared out at the familiar Chicago skyline, its reflection shimmering on Lake Michigan. The appointment wasn't concealed. That was the detail that turned the blood in her veins to ice. They hadn't even tried to be discreet. It was a staggering level of arrogance, a supreme confidence that the grieving grandmother was too old, too fragile, too lost in her sorrow to ever notice their plans. They were profoundly mistaken. Eleanor carried her tea into Amelia's study. Julian hadn't had the nerve to change a thing in here yet. She sat in her daughter's worn leather armchair, which faced a wall of antique city maps. She saw the remnants of a life stolen too soon, research notes for a paper on Sullivan's ornamentation scrawled on a legal pad, a half-finished cup of cold Earl Grey, a pashmina left draped over the arm of the chair, and the faint, lingering scent of Amelia's sandalwood perfume. She saw the sonogram pictures of Leo and Luna tacked to a corkboard. Her daughter was just here, in this very room, brilliant and full of life, cataloging a new acquisition, humming to a classical station, resting a hand on her belly, feeling the gentle flutters of the two lives she was carrying. Eleanor gripped the arms of the chair until her knuckles turned white. She would not weep. Anger was a far more practical emotion. Anger was a compass. It had a true north. Grief was just a storm trying to pull you under. She remained in that room for nearly an hour. When she finally stood, her tea was stone cold. She emptied it into a potted fern. She walked back into the main living space. She gave a warm, convincing smile to the nanny. She gently kissed each of her sleeping grandchildren on the forehead. She complimented Julian on the catered meal he claimed to have prepared. Later that night, when the brownstone was quiet and Julian was locked away in his home office, Eleanor returned to her daughter's study. She moved toward the towering, custom-built bookshelves. Hanging above the desk was Amelia's most prized possession, an original, framed architectural drawing of the Reliance Building. She studied it for a long moment. Then she reached out and pressed a specific spot on the drawing's ornate frame, a tiny carved rosette her own grandfather had pointed out to her as a child. It didn't move. But then she tapped it twice, a pause, then once more, the rhythm of a secret knock they'd used for their childhood clubhouse. A section of the bookshelf beside the desk clicked softly and swung inward, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside was a key, so like her daughter, historical, clever, and concealed within a story. Eleanor's hand trembled as she took the small, antique key, her heart hammering against her ribs. She didn't use it there, not in that house, where every room felt compromised, where the man down the hall was likely texting the woman whose name was on that invoice. She slipped the key into her pocket. She closed the secret panel. The bookshelf settled back into place without a sound. She switched off the library lamp. She would find out what it opened somewhere else, somewhere private, somewhere safe, somewhere Julian Thorne would never think to look. Eleanor drove to a 24-hour secure storage facility where she kept family documents. In a sterile, quiet hallway, she unlocked a small unit. The polished mahogany box sat on a metal shelf, its weight feeling immense, as if it contained the last testament of her daughter. With hands that shook, Eleanor lifted the lid. Inside were 5 items, a thick, handwritten letter, its pages filled with Amelia's scholarly script, an encrypted flash drive attached to a note that read, "It's all here, every document, receipt, and recording. Give this to our lawyer." A set of keys for a safety deposit box at a private bank Eleanor didn't recognize. A stack of professionally printed photographs showing her son-in-law Julian with Chloe Valmont, their affair blatantly obvious, and a small folded piece of stationery. It was folded just once. "Mom, if you're reading this, my fears were real. Don't let him raise my children." The drive holds the truth. Eleanor read the short note 3 times before setting it carefully aside. She picked up the main letter, the thick paper rustling in the silent, climate-controlled air. Amelia's voice filled her mind, not as a nervous, expectant mother, but as a meticulous archivist who had spent months carefully building her case. The letter began without preamble. "Mother, I know how Julian will frame this. It's the narrative he's been crafting for months, that I was just an anxious, hormonal pregnant woman. But I was not paranoid. I found his hidden expense reports. He's been with her for years. The entire time we were struggling with fertility treatments, the whole time I was praying for these babies, he was building another life with her." Eleanor's hands trembled as she held the pages, her eyes flying across the lines. "I noticed an anomaly in the architectural firm's accounts, a recurring vendor payment to Valmont Designs for a penthouse project. The address was redacted, but the budget was enormous. He was funding their future home with our shared assets. I confronted him. He denied everything. He said it was a confidential client, that I was being irrational, that my pregnancy brain was making me see conspiracies. He told me I needed to talk to my therapist, that my anxiety was getting out of control. The letter spanned 10 pages, detailing how Amelia uncovered more evidence, receipts for a suite at a boutique hotel in Lincoln Park, reservation confirmations for tables for two at restaurants he claimed to be visiting with clients, a diamond earring, not hers, found in the glove box of his Range Rover. She detailed how she had hired a private investigator, paying him from her own premarital inheritance. The investigator confirmed it all. The woman was Chloe Valmont, 41 years old, a celebrated interior designer. They had been together for almost 5 years, but the section of the letter that made Eleanor's blood run cold was near the end. I am not writing this because I have a premonition of my own death. I am writing this because Julian has been meeting with his estate lawyer 3 times in the last month. He asked about the clauses in our prenuptial agreement. He asked about the legal transfer of assets upon the death of a spouse. He asked if there were precedents for voiding inheritance claims in cases of postpartum complications. And last week, he asked Dr. Evans if women carrying twins were more susceptible to unforeseen accidents. He said it so calmly, as if he were discussing a downturn in the market. Eleanor lowered the letter, her own breath fogging in the cool air as she stared at the blank metal wall of the storage unit. Her pulse was a dull roar in her ears. She raised the letter again. I've already changed my trust. Our family lawyer helped me restructure it last month. If anything happens to me, my entire inheritance is yours, and my personal assets go into a new trust for the children. Julian is completely written out. I know it seems cruel, but a man who strategizes the financial outcomes of his pregnant wife's death does not deserve her fortune. He does not deserve her children, and he will not be the steward of her legacy. The letter concluded, I truly hope you never have to read this. I hope my instincts are wrong. I hope I come home from the hospital with 2 healthy, screaming babies, and we can burn all of this and laugh about it one day. But if I don't, if the worst is true, you now have everything you need. Fight for them, Mom. The way you fought for me after Dad was gone. You are the strongest person I know. You are the only one I can trust with their lives. I love you. Now go be their grandmother. Your Amelia. Eleanor meticulously folded the pages along their original creases and pressed the letter to her chest, closing her eyes. The hallway was utterly silent. The distant hum of the facility's climate control was the only sound in the world. Despair was a luxury she could no longer entertain. Helen had moved beyond mourning into a quiet state of glacial fury. She stared at the laptop's glowing screen, at the organized folders, the financial statements, the audio recordings. Her daughter, Sophia, had been a world-renowned architect for nearly 15 years before she met Liam. She knew how to build a case as meticulously as she designed a skyscraper. She knew how to blueprint the truth. She understood that in a legal battle, irrefutable documentation was the foundation. The contents of the hard drive were a masterwork of organization. The evidence was sorted into directories named by date and category, a gray folder for offshore accounts, a blue one for private messages, a green one for surveillance footage, and a black one for legal documents. Even while terrified, while carrying twins and being gaslit by her husband, Sophia had been precise, methodical. She had been drafting the plans for a war. Helen started the car. She drove to Marcus Vance's brownstone in Chicago's Gold Coast. It was nearly midnight. She hadn't called ahead. She parked, climbed his limestone steps, and rang the bell, clutching the laptop that held the final, brilliant design of her only child. Marcus, a man in his 50s with the sharp eyes of a trial lawyer, opened the door. He had been Sophia's champion, her first major client after she graduated, the lawyer who had helped her establish her own firm just 1 month before she passed. He looked at Helen's expression, then at the laptop she held, and his face hardened. He led her into his home office without a word. They sat at the antique oak desk in his study until the early hours of the morning. Marcus played every audio file Sophia had saved. He navigated the password-protected drive and scrutinized the Shell Corporation's balance sheets, the text message histories, the photos of Liam and his interior designer, Ava. One audio file in particular caused Marcus to take off his glasses and rub his eyes. It was Liam speaking to Ava, captured by the high-end baby monitor Sophia had installed 2 months before the twins were born. Once the babies are here and she's exhausted, we're set. She'll be so overwhelmed and sleep-deprived, she'll sign the revised partnership agreement for the new tower without even reading it. She trusts me implicitly. Marcus snapped the laptop shut. He was engineering this the entire time, he said, his voice a low growl of disbelief and rage. Before she even delivered, he was scheming to seize her stake in the company. Helen just nodded. She had felt a chill when she saw that woman at the memorial casually directing the caterers in Sophia's home. "What is our first move?" she asked. Marcus looked at Helen, his grief for his friend's daughter a tangible thing in the quiet room. A woman whose genius he'd admired since she was a student was gone. "We execute Sophia's blueprint to the letter," he said. "We go to war." 2 weeks after the funeral, Liam informed Helen it was time for her to leave. He did it in the morning, over espresso and croissants from a bakery Sophia had adored. Helen remembered how Sophia's face lit up when she first found the little shop in Lincoln Park. Now, Liam was using her favorite porcelain cup as if it were just an object, devoid of history, devoid of her. "Helen," he began, his tone soft and patronizing, the measured cadence of a mogul accustomed to compliance. "I think it's time you went home. The twins require a stable routine, and your presence is becoming, well, a little disruptive." Helen placed her cup on its saucer and looked directly into his eyes. "Disruptive?" she repeated. "Their sleep patterns are off. The nanny says you're constantly in the nursery. I am just prioritizing their needs." "Their needs are best met by having their grandmother," Helen countered, her voice dropping to a frigid calm. Liam's smile grew tight, a barely visible clench in his jaw. "I'm grateful for your help," he said, "but this is my home. They are my children. I have to build a new system that works for us." Helen took a measured sip of espresso and offered him a serene smile. "Of course," she said. "You are completely right. I will begin packing." Each word was a carefully constructed facade. She was creating a diversion. Buying Marcus time to prepare the initial court filings, time to be methodical. Sophia's final instructions on the drive were a lesson in strategy. Never reveal your anger, document everything, build your case, then you demolish them. She was gone by 3 in the afternoon, checked into a suite at a long-term hotel less than a mile from the house, close enough to remain a persistent threat, yet far enough away to give Liam the illusion of victory. Within a week, Ava had taken over the home office, the very room where Sophia had sketched the designs that made Liam's real estate empire a landmark success. The same space where she had backed up her evidence and drafted the plan that would become his ruin. Ava remade the minimalist Chicago penthouse. Loud, aggressive art replaced the serene architectural photography Sophia had curated. A gaudy gold sculpture now sat on the desk where Sophia's design awards once stood. She informed the doorman she was supporting Liam through an unspeakable tragedy. She told the other mothers at the park she was a dear friend from his company, there to help the babies. To anyone who would listen, she sighed that the poor twins desperately needed a consistent maternal influence. She conveniently forgot to add that she had been their father's mistress for the last 3 years. The occupation was swift, clinical, and total. Within 3 weeks of Sophia's death, Ava had rewritten the nanny's duties, replaced the custom-designed furniture, and methodically purged every sign of Sophia's impeccable taste from the home. One night, Sarah, Sophia's sister, called Helen, her voice shaking with fury. "Helen, you have to see this. Go to Ava's Instagram. Check her story." Helen's fingers were unsteady as she opened the app. She found the account instantly. It was public. Of course, it was public. Ava lived for an audience. The post was a close-up of a beautifully crafted, custom-made mobile with tiny, hand-carved wooden replicas of Chicago's famous buildings hanging over a crib. Helen's breath hitched. She recognized it immediately. It was Sophia's. Helen had sat with her daughter, 8 months pregnant and on mandatory bed rest, as she whittled the tiny version of the Willis Tower. Their first skyline, Sophia had murmured, her fingers gently sanding the wood, so they can dream of building their own worlds. And now Ava was displaying it, had perfectly lit it for a photo with a caption that read, "Building a beautiful new life, one perfect detail at a time, #grateful." Helen ended the call. She sat on the impersonal hotel sofa, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She breathed in and out slowly, like someone preparing for a collision. The next morning, her lawyer Marcus called with even worse news. He had inquired about the life insurance. Liam had already submitted the claim. $5 million, Marcus said. The policy was updated 3 months ago, increased from $1 million. There was a heavy pause. The change required Sophia's digital signature for authorization. I had a cybersecurity expert analyze the metadata. It wasn't authenticated from her laptop or phone. The signature originated from a desktop computer at Liam's office. A forgery, Helen whispered. Her daughter's life had been monetized, reduced to a fraudulent signature on a policy that would fund Liam's future with the woman defiling her memory on social media. There is more, Marcus said, his voice grim. I've been going through the financial records from Sophia's drive. Liam established a shell company about 2 years ago. He siphoned over $500,000 from their joint investment fund into it. He did it by subtly inflating invoices from his construction projects. What did he use that money for? She asked, a cold dread creeping into her veins. He bought a penthouse condo, a 3-bedroom unit with a view of Lake Michigan. The title is in Ava's name. Helen said nothing. He was also paying Ava monthly installments of $10,000, which he classified as design consulting fees. And Helen, Marcus hesitated. Sophia's inheritance from her father? $200,000? Liam transferred it into the shell company 8 months ago. There is no record of Sophia ever authorizing that transfer. Helen looked up. She saw her own reflection in the dark glass of the hotel window. A 63-year-old woman, her hair now streaked with silver, with lines around her eyes that were once from laughter but were now carved by grief. She looked weary. She was weary, but weary was not the same as defeated. File everything, she ordered, her voice becoming as sharp and hard as steel. Every motion, every injunction, whatever family court we need. I want full guardianship of my grandchildren, and I want Liam Sterling held legally accountable for every dollar he stole from my daughter. For the twins' 2-month checkup, Helen arrived first. She had scheduled the appointment herself with Dr. Miller's office, invoking her authority as the designated secondary medical guardian. She had both infants, Noah and Olivia, sleeping in the advanced double stroller Sophia had researched for weeks before she died. The original gift tag was still tied to the handle. She was confirming their arrival time at the front desk when the door to the waiting room opened. Ava came in, an obscenely expensive baby bag on her shoulder, bottles at the ready, her hair professionally styled, her lipstick a defiant red. She walked straight to the counter and smiled at the receptionist. "I'm here for the Croft infants," she announced, her voice resonating in the quiet reception area. "I'm their legal guardian for this appointment." The half-dozen parents, glued to their phones, looked up. The receptionist's gaze flickered between Evelyn and the younger woman, Amelia, a flicker of confusion in her eyes. Evelyn didn't raise her voice or make a scene. She simply leaned over the double stroller, unbuckled little Noah, and lifted him into her arms. He settled against her, a small, trusting weight of warmth and life. "My appointment is scheduled," Evelyn stated, her tone calm and absolute. "These are my grandchildren. My name is on every one of their medical and legal forms as the primary emergency contact. This woman is a business associate of their father's. She has no legal standing here. Amelia's perfectly composed smile faltered for a fraction of a second before being locked back into place. Julian wanted me to be here, she insisted. He asked me to come. Julian isn't the one who is here, Evelyn replied flatly. I am. Turning her back on Amelia completely, she carried Noah toward the nurse's station. The nurse, taking her cue, followed with Sophie in the stroller. Amelia was left standing alone by the front desk, holding a designer diaper bag that was entirely superfluous. After the checkup, Evelyn drove to the lakefront. She found an empty bench along the path near North Avenue Beach, a spot overlooking the Chicago skyline. It had been Clara's favorite view. She sat, pulling her coat tight against the biting wind coming off the lake. Clara Ann Hayes, beloved daughter, gifted architect, cherished friend. Evelyn didn't cry. She watched the gray waves crash against the shore, gathering her resolve. Peonies. Clara had always loved the peonies in Lincoln Park. Evelyn brushed a stray leaf from the leg of her trousers. With her thumb, she imagined tracing the letters on a cold marble headstone, the words that would be etched there soon. Beloved wife, devoted daughter, brilliant architect. 4 descriptions. They were all true, but they missed the most crucial one. Tactician. That's what her daughter had been forced to become. A tactician who had built a fortress of evidence from a secure off-site server, a series of encrypted hard drives, and perfectly organized financial statements. A tactician who had to fight her war in secret because the man she was married to had convinced her that her instincts were just a symptom of postpartum anxiety. Evelyn stayed until the city lights began to glitter across the water. She rose, her joints stiff from the cold. She placed her palm on the icy metal of the bench. I found the journal, Clara, she whispered to the wind. I have all the passwords. I will not let him erase you. She walked back toward the city. The evening fog was beginning to obscure the tops of the skyscrapers, smudging the sky with the exact shades of charcoal and plum that Clara had chosen for the twins' nursery. A dusky, peaceful sky for the 2 babies she had longed to bring home to it. Evelyn started the car and drove back to her hotel overlooking the river. She ordered a bowl of soup she had no intention of eating. After pushing it around with a spoon, she confirmed with her lawyer, Marcus, that he would file the petition for temporary guardianship at exactly 9 o'clock in the morning. Then, sinking onto the overly firm hotel mattress, she opened her laptop. Inside an encrypted file, she logged the date and time. She documented the condescending tone of the reply from Julian's lawyer. She saved screenshots of every one of Amelia's sickeningly sweet social media posts, published from inside Clara's own home. She transcribed every dismissive text message from Julian. She drafted a list of every architect, client, and friend who could corroborate her version of events. She saved the file and set the laptop on the nightstand next to her daughter's final handwritten letter. A digital fortress and an analog key. One built by Clara, the other wielded by her mother, both serving the same purpose, both fighting the same battle, both protecting 2 tiny, innocent children. Julian's attorney was Harrison Cole, a name synonymous with brutal corporate litigation and backroom deals, a name that knew nothing of the hollow echo in a hotel suite where grief was the only guest. Cole filed a motion for a temporary restraining order to keep Evelyn away from the Lincoln Park brownstone, claiming she was emotionally unstable. The filing argued her grief made her a liability and was violating a father's fundamental right to mourn with his children in private. The motion was designed to paint Evelyn as obsessive and hysterical. A sworn declaration from Beatrice Croft, Julian's mother, a woman who moved through the world in tailored silk and could appraise a person's net worth in a single glance, was attached. Beatrice alleged Evelyn was prone to dramatics and had always interfered. She claimed Evelyn's constant texts and calls were creating an unstable environment for the newborns and the entire family. Marcus reviewed the documents from his office high above Wacker Drive, his face a mask on the video call. He read through the entire filing once, then read it a second time before taking a long, slow sip of water. "They're isolating you," he told Evelyn, his voice even. "It's a textbook move. Discredit the grandmother, control the story, frame you as irrational. By the time we get to the actual hearing, they've already tainted the judge's perception of you." "So what's our move?" Evelyn asked. "We file our own petition for grandparent visitation, citing Illinois state statutes. But our real offensive is this. I'm filing a motion to have the court appoint a guardian ad litem for the twins. That's a neutral, third-party lawyer, assigned by the court, who represents only one client, the children. Not me, and not Julian, just them," he emphasized. "What are our grounds for requesting one? Our grounds are that Julian Croft moved his lead architect, a single woman with whom he has a documented personal and professional history, into the marital residence less than 4 weeks after his wife's death, that he subsequently hired that woman's former assistant to serve as the children's full-time nanny. That preliminary financial analysis shows a pattern of highly unusual wire transfers to offshore entities, and that the children's deceased mother maintained a secure server with digital correspondence indicating she feared for their long-term welfare." Shock Evelyn was silent for a moment, the low horn of a passing barge on the river floating through her open window, the hum of traffic, the distant city sounds, all the ordinary noises of a world that hadn't stopped turning just because hers had. "File it," she said. Marcus also submitted a motion to compel DNA verification for both infants. He told Evelyn it was standard procedure in contested guardianships, but she detected something else in his voice, a lawyerly caution that went beyond mere procedure. "Why insist on the forensic audit?" she asked. "Because the money trail from their joint accounts to his new philanthropic fund," David Chen said carefully, "starts the same week Chloe began her fertility treatments. And in my world, tech moguls who build empires on stolen code are rarely honest about just one thing." The preliminary hearing was a month away, just 1 month, 28 days to prepare, to strategize, to exist in a sterile Boston hotel suite, while Arthur posted artfully somber photos of himself overseeing the construction of the Chloe Matheson Memorial Wing at the City Art Museum. Diana made every moment matter. She met with David's forensic specialist, a man named Kenji with impeccably tailored suits, who spoke of encrypted ledgers the way a historian speaks of ancient scrolls. Kenji illustrated the digital maze as if it were a blueprint for a heist. The Shell Corporation in Delaware, the wire transfers coded as art acquisitions, the waterfront penthouse in the Seaport District registered to a holding company, the monthly payments disguised as gallery consulting, the AI-cloned voice signature used to authorize a stock transfer, the inheritance that had simply evaporated. He constructed a digital fortress, Kenji stated, his expression a mixture of professional respect and deep disgust. "It looks invulnerable from the outside, but the entire architecture is built on a lie." Sarah, Chloe's best friend from design school, provided her own statement. She remembered the call from Chloe asking for help clearing out her home studio, which was supposed to become the nursery. She recalled the odd posts about needing soundproofing for the baby's room, which seemed excessive. She described a brilliant, sharp-witted woman who, over the years of her marriage, had been methodically gaslighted from a creative force into a bundle of nerves. "She just started to shrink," Sarah told David, her voice thick with regret. "Especially over the last year. She'd back out of our weekly critiques. She skipped her printmaking class. There was always a new reason, some excuse about a deadline or a client crisis. Always a quick defense of Arthur. I should have asked more questions. I should have seen what he was doing to her. I didn't, and now that's on me." Liam, Chloe's brother, flew in from Chicago and took the suite adjoining Diana's. He arrived with a small carry-on, a laptop bag, and a controlled rage in his eyes that was both comforting and terrifying. "I'm not going to cause a scene," he promised Diana, "but I'm not going anywhere, not until he pays." The days leading up to the hearing were heavy with a silent pressure that lodged in her chest, making her heartbeat echo in her ears. Diana spent her mornings at the hotel gym, just walking on the treadmill, a relentless, punishing pace, one foot in front of the other, the only action that felt like moving forward. In the afternoons, she explored the contents of Chloe's encrypted hard drive. David had a specialist bypass the security. It wasn't a diary, it was a case file, a meticulously organized archive of screen captures, metadata, and design drafts that told the story of a secret, soul-crushing investigation. The first few dated entries were filled with light. Week 10, we saw the heartbeat, a tiny, perfect flicker. I had to sit in the car for 10 minutes before I could drive home. I was just overwhelmed. Arthur just smiled and held my hand. I guess it doesn't feel real to the guys until the baby is actually here. Week 13. The nausea is brutal, but I honestly don't mind. One strong heartbeat. I would be sick for 9 straight months if it meant he was healthy. Week 17. We started talking about names. Arthur wanted something classic. I was leaning towards something more modern. We compromised on Julian, after my grandfather, and because Chloe thought it sounded strong and kind. Then the tone of the evidence started to shift, a slow creep of suspicion that eventually became a certainty. Week 21. Arthur felt him kick. He actually teared up. For a second, I thought I had been wrong about everything. Week 23. He bailed on the meeting with the nursery designer. Said there was a last-minute server emergency at the office. An alert for a shared file update appeared on my tablet later that night. Seaport Penthouse, final floor plans, AM. Our anniversary is in October. My name is Chloe, not AM. Week 25. I found a wire transfer confirmation on his bank statement, a 2-year lease on a penthouse in the Seaport district. It wasn't one of his company's corporate apartments. I ran a search on the address. Week 29. I looked up the holding company that owns the penthouse. The sole proprietor is Ava Monroe, a gallery owner. The woman he brought to his company's benefit dinner last spring. Just a business contact, he had said. Week 31. I used a data forensics program on his old work server backup. He had searched best asset protection lawyers in Boston and how to establish a blind trust offshore. He was doing this before we even saw the fertility specialist. He was building his exit strategy while we were building our family. Diana shut the laptop. She rested her hand on its cool metal surface as if she could feel the echo of her daughter's fingers as she had saved each file, documenting each betrayal, all by herself, while she was carrying a child and her husband was constructing an entirely separate life. She navigated to the very last file, Week 33, the final entry, saved 4 days before her emergency delivery. I'm not staying because I'm weak. I'm staying because I am carrying our son and I have no safe place he couldn't penetrate with his money and his lawyers. But I'm preparing. Every single day, I am preparing. My mother has no idea. No one does. But they will. When the time is right, they will. She had been designing a new life with one hand and documenting its destruction with the other. Building a nursery and building her case during the same quiet nights, choosing paint colors and embedding scanned bank statements into the metadata of innocuous design files. A woman fighting a war on 2 fronts, wrapped in silence because her husband had brilliantly convinced her that her own sharp intuition was a symptom of emotional instability. Diana powered down the old laptop. The external hard drive sat beside it, its indicator light blinking a steady, soft rhythm. 2 parts of a single life, a mother's boundless love and a daughter's hidden terror, sitting on a desk in a quiet apartment in Boston. She switched off the lamp and sat in the darkness, listening to the low hum of the old building. She thought about her Chloe, the witty, passionate graphic designer she was before she met Arthur. The kind of woman who could spend hours finding the perfect font for a project, who filled notebooks with vibrant, chaotic sketches, who sang terribly and loudly to the car radio. That woman had been slowly, methodically erased, replaced by someone more cautious, more watchful, someone who archived her own life as if she were a stranger because she knew down to her bones that her word would never be enough to stand against his. Diana pulled a faded quilt over her shoulders and looked out at the city lights. "You were right, my sweet girl," she whispered into the silent room. "You were right about everything, and I am so profoundly sorry I didn't see what you were trying to show me." The window showed only her own pale reflection. The building hummed. The apartment was still. From a nearby unit, she could hear the distant sound of a television, a sudden buzzer, a swell of applause. Diana didn't even think about sleep. She preserved her strength. She would need all of it for the storm that was about to break. The courtroom felt smaller than she had imagined. Department 3, C, Probate and Family Court. The hallway smelled of industrial cleaner and stale fear. The overhead fluorescent lights hummed, casting a pale, sickly light on everyone's faces. Diana wore a simple navy blazer Chloe had given her for her birthday 3 years ago. Inside her leather tote bag was the hard drive, a quiet little bomb waiting for its moment. Arthur arrived with his lawyer, both of them dressed in dark, expensive suits. Damien appeared composed, almost tranquil, a man whose conscience was clear and whose mind was untroubled. From his position across the courtroom, he gave Eleanor a fleeting, condescending glance. With the practiced gravity of someone performing the role of a heartbroken husband, Damien took his seat just behind Simone Dubois, his company's chief of product. Eleanor made a point not to look at the other woman. Her eyes were fixed on the judge's bench, anxiously awaiting the start of the hearing. Damien's lawyer, a man named Sterling, commenced his opening remarks. He spun a tale of a visionary tech founder, a loving partner devastated by the tragic passing of his wife, now courageously embracing the duty of raising their 2 infant daughters alone. He depicted Eleanor as a well-meaning but meddlesome grandmother, incapable of respecting her own daughter's life choices. He deployed the word intrusive on 4 separate occasions. He used the phrase emotionally unstable twice. He implied that Eleanor's sorrow had concocted a delusion in which she was a savior instead of an obstacle. The man was good. Eleanor had to give him that. He had the sort of steady, commanding voice that evoked generational wealth and unshakable confidence. Then Simone was called to the stand. She portrayed Eleanor as a woman who had never given Damien a fair chance, who persistently undermined Clara's contentment. She claimed that Eleanor had arrived at their Seattle home unannounced after the twins were born, fostering a tense atmosphere and staying until Damien was forced to politely ask her to leave. She testified that Eleanor's inquiries to Clara's fertility specialist were incessant and unsettling. Every accusation was a sliver of fact, wrapped in a heavy cloak of misrepresentation. That was the brilliance of their approach. They weren't inventing fictions out of thin air. They were masters of the subtle craft of distortion, twisting reality to fit their narrative. Eleanor's attorney remained seated. He let them build their case. He let their carefully fabricated story hang in the silent courtroom. Only then did he rise. "Your Honor," he stated, his tone even, "we can demonstrate that Mr. Vance's version of the story is not simply an alternative viewpoint, but a deliberately engineered falsehood." He explained the existence of encrypted project files on a vintage laptop, unlocked using a specific bar of a Scarlatti Sonata. He then displayed the financial records from an undeclared account, revealing substantial monthly payments to Simone Dubois. He outlined the agreement for a luxury penthouse overlooking Puget Sound, funded by that very account, along with digital receipts for designer clothing, exotic cars, and private getaways. Sterling then presented printed transcripts from Clara's video diaries where she detailed Damien's escalating psychological manipulation. Finally, he played a short video file from the laptop. It was a clip Clara had recorded, her face pale and tired. Off-screen, Damien's voice was sharp. After everything I've provided, you'd think you could show some appreciation, but by all means, call your mother. Who do you imagine she's going to trust? A washed-up musician or me? A collective gasp went through the courtroom. The atmosphere became dense, electrified by the abrupt and public demolition of a private deception. The judge then permitted Eleanor to respond to Damien's allegations. Eleanor stood. She looked at the judge, then stared directly at Damien, and finally at Simone. When she spoke, her voice was low but resonated in every corner of the room. "Your Honor, my daughter is gone." She paused, allowing the gravity of her statement to permeate the silence. "She has left behind 2 daughters who will only know their mother from photographs. They will never be held in her arms. They will never hear her play the Bach suites that I played for her." The room was utterly still. No one stirred. The man who vowed to protect her was architecting a new life with his lover before my daughter had even passed. He siphoned her inheritance to finance their future. He systematically cut her off from everyone who loved her. And now he has the audacity to stand in this court and paint my devotion to my child as a form of instability. Her voice lowered, acquiring a razor's edge, the tone of a woman who had moved beyond grief into pure determination. "I am not standing here because I am unstable. I am not standing here because I am crippled by sorrow. I am here because my daughter anticipated this day. She left me a key. She left me a catalog of truths she was too terrified to voice herself. She entrusted me with a solemn responsibility, and I intend to fulfill it." The judge observed Eleanor for a long, quiet moment. Her gaze shifted to Damien. She glanced at the mountain of evidence Eleanor's lawyer had provided. She suspended Damien's parental rights, pending a more thorough investigation. She granted Eleanor temporary guardianship of the twins. She rejected the motion for a restraining order. A single vein pulsed on Damien's forehead, a small, furious rhythm. Eleanor saw it. She met his enraged stare and did not flinch. Out on the courthouse steps, Leo was pacing. As a potential witness, he hadn't been permitted inside during the testimony. He was humming with a restless, artistic energy that could just as easily compose a masterpiece as it could start an inferno. Damien burst out of a side door. Leo saw him and immediately blocked his path before Eleanor could intervene. "You deleted my sister," Leo said. His voice was not loud, but it was potent, filled with more force than any scream. "You didn't just shatter her spirit, you made her believe she was already shattered. You stole her confidence, you stole her music, you stole her very essence, and now you're trying to take her children." Damien paused. He assessed Leo with an air of cold, analytical observation. He adjusted the cuff of his bespoke shirt, a small, arrogant gesture from a man who considered himself utterly beyond reproach. "Your sister was a highly sensitive person, Leo," he said, his tone silky and condescending. "She had trouble coping with pressure. The pregnancy was a lot for her to handle. Everything I have done is to ensure a stable ecosystem for my daughters. I'm sorry you don't have the bandwidth to comprehend the complexities of the situation." Leo's hands were clenched into tight fists. Eleanor placed a hand on his forearm, a firm, steadying touch that communicated, "Not here, not like this. I need you with me." Leo inhaled deeply and took a step back. He looked at Damien one final time. "Clara knew who you were," he said, "behind the keynote speeches and the IPOs and the perfect public image. He has a void where his heart should be, and she filled it with a truth so solid he can never break it." Julian offered no reply. He turned, walked to his silver lucid air, and slid inside. The door sealed, encasing him in absolute silence. He sat there for a long minute before the car silently powered on. That evening, Eleanor was alone in her Pacific Heights Victorian. She felt herself collapse into a wingback chair in the study, not a conscious movement, but a surrender of her weary body. She pulled a framed photograph of her daughter from the mantelpiece and held it in her lap. "I don't know how I'll see this through, Alara," she whispered to the empty room. "I'm a retired history professor. I'm up against a tech billionaire with a legion of lawyers who treat the truth like a software glitch to be patched. I'm not sure I have the strength." The study was lined with books on ancient civilizations, maps, and a single Tiffany lamp casting a warm glow. Eleanor looked down at the photograph. She saw her own exhausted face reflected in the glass, but also her daughter's inquisitive eyes the same firm set of her jaw. Her daughter, a brilliant mind, looking right back at her. Eleanor placed her palms on the mahogany arms of the chair. She pushed herself to her feet. She stood, meeting her own reflection in the bay window overlooking the glittering city. She went to the wet bar, poured a glass of water, and returned to her large, organized desk. She didn't phone a friend for comfort. She opened a new legal pad and began to write, cataloging every vulnerability, every inconsistency, every possible point of attack. The silence of the house was no longer hollow. It was the intense quiet of a scholar preparing for the fight of her life. The penthouse apartment felt suffocating, the air thick with unspoken accusations. Desperate for space, Julian took the elevator down and had his driver take him to a minimalist sushi bar in Hayes Valley. He took a seat at the cypress counter. The room was serene, smelling of vinegar, rice, and fresh sea air. In Itamai, his movements precise and practiced, gave a slight bow. "Omakase," Julian said, his voice flat, "and a bottle of Junmai Daiginjo." He sat on the simple wooden stool, watching the city's new elite, a crypto founder bragging about a token launch, two venture capitalists dissecting a pitch deck over sake, a group of software engineers celebrating a product release. He barely tasted the exquisite nigiri. The cool, bracing flavor was lost on him. It had been Ilara's favorite place. They'd always come here to celebrate a successful research grant. Julian left $500 for a $200 meal. He walked the dozen blocks back to his building, letting the damp San Francisco fog chill him to the bone. He didn't bother with the climate control in his suite. He let the cold seep in, a stark reminder that he was in a war he was losing, and he could not afford to fail. 6 months had passed since Ilara's funeral. The posthumous email she had scheduled to be sent could be his salvation or his ruin. David Chen had spent that time trying to crack the encryption. He'd had told Julian to expect the worst. Julian was not a patient man. He was many things: ambitious, ruthless, heartbroken, and enraged, but patience was a virtue he'd never cultivated. The call came on a Tuesday morning. Julian was in a board meeting, staring out at the Golden Gate Bridge. His phone buzzed with a priority notification from his lawyer, David Chen. "Julian," David said, his voice tight and professional, "are you somewhere private?" He was already standing and walking to the adjoining private office. A junior partner shot him a nervous glance, and he shut the glass door behind him. "We have access to Ilara's private server," David said. Julian's pulse pounded in his ears. He could hear the faint hum of the building's ventilation, the distant sound of the city, the frantic beat of his own heart. The entire world seemed to shrink to the size of his phone. "The twins," David continued, and then he paused. A rare hesitation in his usually unflappable demeanor. "Alex and Olivia." Her research logs contain the results of a private genetic screening, along with a time-stamped video diary entry. "Neither of them carry your genetic markers, Julian." The world didn't spin. Instead, a towering structure of fear he hadn't realized he'd been building simply disintegrated. The gray San Francisco sky suddenly looked brilliant. "Repeat that," he commanded, his voice a hoarse whisper. He had to hear it again, to make the words real, to solidify this unbelievable victory. "I said neither of them is biologically yours, not one. The screening was conducted by a third-party lab and is 100% definitive. You are not the biological father of either of Ilara's children." Julian leaned his hand against the cool floor-to-ceiling glass of his office. He felt the smooth, unyielding surface. He was still here, still in this tower, still in a world that had just been completely, miraculously upended. "How in the hell is that possible?" he breathed. David started to explain, outlining the brilliant, devastating plan Ilara had set in motion. For 2 years, Ilara and Julian had been using a prestigious fertility clinic. Julian was assured his genetic contributions were exceptional, perfect for continuing his family's legacy of innovation. After 2 surrogacy attempts failed, the clinic's head geneticist recommended further screening on Julian's side, just as a precaution. Julian had refused, furious at the implication of any flaw in his DNA. Ilara's logs showed she returned to the clinic the following week by herself. She authorized the use of an anonymous, extensively screened donor. Julian Croft's name was nowhere on the authorization paperwork. "She knew I would never agree," Julian murmured, understanding dawning. "Precisely," David confirmed. "Her notes are meticulous. They warned her of a significant probability of passing on a rare genetic disorder from your paternal line. They strongly advised against using your sample. She chose the donor. She never told you." Julian was silent for a full minute. He thought of the high-tech bio-monitored nursery, a symbol of perfect creation. "Why, David? Why wouldn't she tell me?" "There was a video log file on the server," David said, his voice softening. "She recorded it for herself the day she made the decision." He played the audio. "The counselor laid it out for me," Ilara's voice said, calm and clear. "The risk was unacceptable, so I chose a different path. I didn't tell Julian because he would have refused. He would have chosen his perfect code over the health of our children. And I wanted my children more than I wanted his permission. It was the first time in our marriage I made a decision that was purely for them and for myself." Julian closed his eyes, the words rewriting the entire history of his marriage, of his wife's quiet strength. Ilara hadn't been unfaithful in the way he thought. She had made a secret, rational medical choice because the man she was married to was too arrogant to see past his own reflection, too obsessed with his legacy to prioritize the well-being of his own children. And this was the woman whose mother was now suing for sole guardianship of 2 children who weren't his, fighting to control an inheritance built on Ilara's genius, all while trying to paint him as an unfit parent. "So what's next?" Julian asked. "Eleanor's entire case just evaporated. A retired professor with no biological claim has no legal standing against the children's presumed father, especially with this," David said. "And this is where her own smugness becomes her undoing." When Sophia, Julian's partner, heard the news, her reaction was exactly what Julian's legal team had hoped for. "She was the one living a lie," Sophia announced to Julian, to his parents, to their entire social circle. "She was the cheater all along. The babies aren't even his." For 3 days, Sophia basked in what she thought was a moral victory. This was her vindication. It was proof that Ilara was the fraud, and Julian was the one who had been wronged. She told her friends, her followers, and even drafted a triumphant post for her tech gossip blog. Then, David Chen's firm released a single devastating statement to a leading financial newspaper. It contained an anonymized summary of the genetic risk report and a timeline proving Ilara's choice was to prevent a disease, not to deceive her husband. The public perception didn't just change, it imploded and reformed in an instant. Ilara hadn't betrayed Julian. Ilara had saved her children from him. She had monitored the surrogate's health with obsessive detail. She had managed the complex process with incredible focus. She had designed their nursery to optimize cognitive development and filled it with educational toys. And she did it all while knowing the man she was married to was sleeping with another woman. Eleanor wasn't just defeated, she was publicly and socially humiliated. Her daughter's legacy, her quiet dignity, the moral high ground she'd claimed, all of it was exposed as a lie she'd told herself. Her son-in-law Julian called her that evening. His voice was cold steel. "You and I are going to come to an arrangement about my children," he said, "and you will not drag my family name or Ilara's through the mud ever again." He disconnected the call. The crushing weight of his victory was absolute. Damien had spent years being unfaithful to the one person who was genuinely managing the well-being and future of their growing family. He had deceived her, siphoned money from their shared assets, and committed fraud, all while Clara was enduring the taxing, solitary ordeal of medical consultations, hormone injections, hope, and despair. She bore it all quietly, aware that her husband's sole tangible contribution to their family was one compromised biological donation. Dr. Evelyn Reed called Eleanor later that week. Her voice was steady and measured, the sound of a professional who had carried a burden of confidentiality for too long. "Mrs. Hayes," she said, "there's something I must share with you. Your daughter had a meeting with me right before her final medical procedure. She said something to me that I have never been able to forget." Eleanor held her breath. She said, "If something were to happen to me, you must promise that you'll do whatever it takes to make sure my mother becomes their legal guardian, not Damien. You have to promise me." I reassured her that she had nothing to worry about. The doctor went on, her voice strained with regret. "I was mistaken. But I recall her precise phrasing, and I am willing to repeat it in a sworn affidavit if it proves useful." Eleanor collapsed into a chair, gripping the phone tightly. She could hear her daughter's voice in the doctor's words, powerful, resolute, and protecting her children from beyond the grave. Asterisk, not Damien. My mother. She expressed her gratitude to Dr. Reed and hung up. She remained in the darkening hotel room, making no move to switch on a lamp. She didn't need the light. She understood the situation with perfect, unwavering clarity. Damien immediately launched a public relations offensive. He chose a writer from a prominent business magazine, a journalist known for his gentle interviews and glowing profiles of industry leaders. Damien sat opposite him in their stark, minimalist living room, which had been purged of all of Claire's instruments and personal belongings. He was dressed in a simple, expensive cashmere sweater, the ideal image of a man in quiet mourning, a man with nothing to hide. "I adored my wife," he declared, his voice expertly cracking. The camera zoomed in on his eyes, which held a carefully produced glisten of wetness, conveying deep sadness without the messiness of actual tears. "I believed we were creating a future. I believed these children were our shared legacy, a part of her, a part of me." To discover that this foundation might have been a lie is the most profound betrayal a person can endure. The journalist gently brought up the matter of the affair. Damien navigated it like a seasoned professional. "I was not a flawless husband," he admitted, "but my dedication to Clara was absolute, and I never, for an instant, questioned that I was the father of her children. That fundamental truth was taken from me without my knowledge." The expose was published on several tech news sites the next day. By noon, the comment threads had erupted into a war zone, dividing the tech community. One camp rallied behind the celebrated CEO, a man grieving his lost wife. The other camp was far less sympathetic. Damien Vance had made a critical error in judgment. He was a master at manipulating venture capital, engineering corporate acquisitions, and charming donors at exclusive galas. But the internet is not a boardroom. The internet is the worldwide court of public opinion, and it had some very pointed questions. If he was so devastated by his wife's passing, why was his new partner, a well-known gallery owner, photographed accepting the keys to a waterfront penthouse less than a month after the funeral? If he was so blindsided by the existence of a secret child, why had his legal team already filed motions to take control of Chloe's personal seven-figure stock portfolio? Why was he trying to fold her independent design studio's assets into his own corporation? David Chen, Chloe's lawyer, let the public relations disaster rage for 3 full days. He let the questions fester and the public opinion solidify. Then, with the complete backing of Chloe's mother, Diana, he released a carefully chosen set of documents to some of the nation's most respected tech journalists. There was a stock transfer authorization bearing Chloe's signature, presented alongside a forensic analysis confirming it was an AI-generated forgery. There were financial statements that detailed a $2 million transfer from a marital account to a shell corporation, which was then used to finance the purchase of the very penthouse Ava Monroe now called home. And there was a server log, forensically retrieved, that proved the affair began nearly a year before they had ever set foot in a fertility clinic. Arthur had been with Ava the entire time, but it was one encrypted text message, now unsealed in the public court record for any journalist to see, that utterly ruined him. The message from Arthur to Ava was sent 9 months before Chloe's death. As soon as the baby is born and she's overwhelmed, we can start moving. She'll sign off on any transfer I put in front of her. She's completely oblivious. The perception of him in the city didn't just crack, it shattered. The story moved quietly but quickly through Chicago's most influential circles, passed between women on charity boards, in law firms, and in executive suites, their messages burning with a shared, familiar anger. Notes of support poured in from women who knew the script by heart. The secret credit cards, the unexplained business trips, the experience of being called crazy, hormonal, or unstable. Clara wasn't a tragic victim. She was a strategist. She was the woman who protected her children from the other side, the woman who designed a legal firewall while she was designing a nursery, the woman who fought her war silently and won it posthumously. Then Amelia called Marcus. It was late on a Thursday night. Marcus was preparing for a deposition when his personal line rang, showing a blocked number. He almost ignored it, but answered on the final ring. "Mr. Thorne," a shaky voice said, "my name is Amelia Vance. I have to meet with you." She paused. "And I am positive you are going to want to hear what I have to say." She was waiting in the lobby of his building the next morning. She was pale. Her expensive coat looked like it had been slept in, and her eyes were wide and vacant. She looked like someone who had just discovered her entire life was a lie. She looked like someone who was done playing the game. She told him the whole story. Julian was already involved with someone else, not Clara, and not even her. A third woman, a private equity manager from London named Soraya. The text messages were from the week after the funeral, while Amelia was arranging for decorators for the new condo, while she was posting carefully curated photos of baby gifts online, believing she'd secured her position. "I saw the texts on his tablet," Amelia said, her voice devoid of all emotion. "He must have found my messages the same way Clara must have found them. It has a certain grim irony, wouldn't you say? Except I'm not the one who's pregnant, and I'm not the one who's dead." Chloe pushed her tablet across the polished mahogany desk toward Mr. Harrison. It displayed a cascade of secured emails, communications she had started archiving weeks ago. The lawyer read as Chloe explained Julian's strategy to portray Eleanor as an emotionally volatile executive, unfit to be a mother. Julian had coached Chloe, giving her a script and a fabricated timeline for their affair. He argued that to win the coming custody battle, he needed a serene, artistic partner by his side, complaining that the courts are always biased against powerful single fathers. Then she revealed the final, chilling detail, the piece of information that made Mr. Harrison set down his pen and sit back in his chair. "He told me I would be the kind of mother his son deserved," Chloe said. "Not because he loved me or even wanted to be a father, but because my career was a public relations asset. It was the exact same way he treated Eleanor, like a brilliant, high-value acquisition who made him look like the visionary developer he was so desperate to be." Mr. Harrison studied her for a long moment. "And what is it you want from me?" he inquired. Chloe's eyes were bright with unshed tears. She gazed at the glossy surface of the desk, at the architect's watch Julian had given her, the same limited edition model Eleanor's own forensic accountant had been tracking. "I am not the hero here," she admitted, her voice trembling. "I'm fully aware of my role. I knew he was married. I let myself believe she was a cold workaholic who didn't understand him, the oldest excuse in the book. but I was completely in the dark about the shell corporations in the Cayman Islands. I didn't know he was leveraging their shared real estate portfolio to fund his new solo venture. I had no idea he was systematically draining her personal investment accounts while she was carrying the child he made me think was ours. She unfastened the watch and laid it on the desk. I actually thought he was in love with me. I was a fool about that, too. Mr. Harrison picked up the timepiece, glanced at the custom inscription on the back, and set it down. "Are you willing to provide a sworn affidavit?" he asked. "Yes," she confirmed. "Under oath, in a deposition, on the evening news, whatever you need." Eleanor learned of Chloe's confession from Mr. Harrison later that day. She sat in her quiet penthouse, taking in the information without a single word. "I have no intention of forgiving her," Eleanor said at last. "Let's make that perfectly clear. She had an affair with my husband. She was designing the home that was meant to be mine. She showcased photos of my granddaughter's nursery on her blog. That was a line that could never be uncrossed." "I understand," Mr. Peterson said, "but if her testimony can dismantle his empire," Diana replied, "then I will leverage it. Isabel would have done the same. My daughter was a strategist. She used every piece on the board." That weekend, Diana took the infant to the Lincoln Park Conservatory. It was the first time she had risked taking her out during one of the court-monitored visits. The bespoke, gyroscopically stabilized bassinet Isabel had commissioned from a design firm she admired had been delivered 3 days after her death, the tracking number a ghost in her cloud account. Diana could never bring herself to erase it. A tiny fragment of data with Isabel's name, a digital echo of a mother who had fully expected to be the one showing her daughter the flowers. She wandered for 2 hours through the glass houses, past the lily pond, and by the bench where she and a young Isabel used to sit, where Isabel would fill sketchbooks with designs for towers that could touch the sky. She would not think about the courtroom. She would not think about Ethan. She would not think about firewalled trading algorithms or offshore shell corporations or encrypted communications. The parenting guide said she was too young for a real smile, but Diana heard it anyway, a tiny, bright, reflexive sound like a bubble of pure delight. She walked for 2 hours and did not glance at her phone once. The final hearing was held on a Monday in courtroom 504. The same buzzing fluorescent lights, the same aroma of burnt coffee, the same worn tile floors. But the energy in the room had shifted. The air was heavy with tension, charged like the sky over Lake Michigan before a summer storm. Diana wore the gray Armani suit again, the one Isabel had insisted she buy for a benefit gala. She carried a leather portfolio with her initials, DLV inside, stored as a secure file on a tablet, was a copy of Isabel's letter. She ran her thumb over the cool screen through the leather before she took her seat, a silent plea for strength. Ethan arrived by himself. He had let his high-priced legal team go. His new counsel was younger, more affordable, and looked utterly overwhelmed. His mother, a pillar of Chicago society, was nowhere in sight. She had apparently stopped accepting her son's calls after the story broke on a prominent financial news site, after the incriminating documents were leaked, after the family name was irrevocably tied to words like fraud, deceit, and betrayal. Mr. Peterson began the presentation. It was methodical, chronological, and completely devastating. The financial fraud, the forged e-signatures on partnership deals, the labyrinth of shell companies, the secret penthouse apartment in the Gold Coast, the plundering of a family trust. Each piece of evidence was presented with an architect's precision. Perhaps Mr. Peterson had learned it from Isabel, or she from him. Either way, the case was constructed like one of Isabel's projects. Color-coded, cross-indexed, flawlessly documented, and structurally sound. The DNA analysis, the documents from the fertility clinic, the donor agreement signed solely by Isabel, the physician's testimony, the encrypted video diary entry where she articulated her decision to become a mother by herself. Then came Chloe's testimony. She took the stand, speaking in a calm, measured voice. She didn't weep. She outlined the affair, the timeline, the saved voicemails about their future together, the audio recordings of Ethan planning how to handle Diana, and the stunning discovery of a second woman he was involved with. He never loved me, Chloe stated. He never loved Isabel. He doesn't love that child. He loves the myth of Ethan Blackwood, the genius financier with the brilliant family and the flawless life. We were all just positions in his portfolio. And when a position turns against him, he liquidates it. Ethan's new lawyer made an attempt at cross-examination. It was short and futile. The evidence was too thorough, the timeline too exact, the digital trail too wide. Dr. Chen testified next, remembering Isabel's instruction, "If anything should happen to me, you make sure my mother gets my baby." She said it plainly. The words required no enhancement. Isabel's partner at the architecture firm testified about her friend's shift in demeanor, the hushed phone calls, the way her laughter disappeared, the celebrated architect who suddenly began skipping major industry events. The friend she wished she had tried harder to reach. The guardian ad litem presented her findings. She had spent 4 weeks interviewing everyone connected to the case, inspecting both residences, and observing the infant with Diana and with Ethan. Her recommendation was unwavering. The child's well-being is best served by granting sole custody to her maternal grandmother, Diana Vance, Mrs. Vance has offered consistent, nurturing care. Mr. Blackwood has displayed a pattern of deception, financial malfeasance, and a value system that does not place his child first. The judge deliberated for 2 hours. For 2 hours, Diana sat on a bench in the corridor, her gaze locked on the opposite wall, holding her portfolio to her chest and concentrating on her breathing. Isabel's old friend from Yale paced back and forth, his dress shoes making a nervous rhythm on the linoleum. Her business partner sat beside her, holding her hand. She remained silent. She understood that words were not what was necessary. Decades of friendship with Isabel had taught her that the women in this family didn't need platitudes, they needed solidarity. The bailiff summoned them back inside. The courtroom rose. The judge came in, sat, and organized her documents. She put on her reading glasses. In the matter of the guardianship of Alara Vance Blackwood, the judge started, "This court finds as follows." Diana's heart pounded against her ribs. She could feel her pulse in her throat, in her temples, a frantic rhythm against the cold silence. Full and sole legal and physical custody is hereby awarded to Diana Lynn Vance. Diana pressed her eyelids shut. She made no noise. She shed no tear. She just closed her eyes and let the words permeate her being. The court also orders that Ethan Blackwood must repay all funds illegally transferred from the marital assets and the estate of the deceased. The fraudulent transfer of company shares is hereby referred to the Securities and Exchange Commission for a full investigation. Ethan sat like a man carved from stone. His lawyer leaned over and whispered something into his ear. Ethan offered a single, almost imperceptible shake of his head, the motion of a king who had just been checkmated. Mr. Blackwood's trading license will be suspended indefinitely pending the outcome of the federal fraud inquiry. Any claims to parental authority are hereby denied. The judge then lifted her gaze from the documents before her. Her eyes met Diana's. "Mrs. Vance, your daughter built an astonishing fortress, not only of evidence, but of love. This court recognizes the profound measures Isabel Blackwood took to protect her child. It is this court's honor to enforce her final directives." Diana slowly opened her eyes. She met the judge's gaze and gave one firm nod. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said, and her voice, for the first time in months, was perfectly clear. In the marble hallway outside, David passed Diana a second envelope. This one was different from the legal files. It was small, cream-colored, and sealed with a simple piece of washi tape. Written on the front in Isabel's elegant calligraphic hand were 2 words, "For Mom, later." "She entrusted this to me a month before she delivered the baby," David said quietly. "Her instructions were precise. I was only to give it to you after the guardianship was fully settled." She said you would understand why when the time came. Diana clutched the envelope. It felt impossibly light, just a few pieces of paper, but the emotional gravity of it was overwhelming. She didn't access it at the lawyer's office. She didn't even look at it in the rideshare home. She went straight to Alara's restaurant, now silent and dark, and sat in the chef's office overlooking the empty kitchen. The city lights of Chicago began to blur into a cold electric tapestry. It was early autumn, and a single stubborn maple leaf clung to the window, a flash of defiant crimson against the steel and glass. Alara had always loved the fall. She said it was nature's final, most brilliant performance before the quiet of winter. Margaret slid the small, encrypted keycard into the laptop. A password prompt appeared. "Dear Mom," the document read. Once she'd typed the line of poetry only they would know. "If you're seeing this, it means two things are certain. The babies are safe, and you made sure of it. I know I should have told you everything about Arthur, his analyst Sophie, the leveraged data, the fertility clinic. I was so deeply embarrassed. Not about needing a donor, but about loving a man who made me feel like it was a flaw I had to conceal. These children are mine. Every cell, every tiny pulse, every kick that wakes me at 3 a.m. I chose them. I nurtured them. I whisper to them every single night. I told them about you, Mom. I told them you make the best coq au vin in the world, that you always tear up during classic movies, and that you will love them just as you loved me, fiercely and without condition. I am not afraid of leaving. I am terrified of them being raised in Arthur's world of metrics and algorithms. That's why I created this digital archive. That's why I hired Diane. That's why I changed my entire estate plan. You're going to be overwhelmed, Mom. 2 newborns at 61. But I know you. I know your strength. You supported me through culinary school when everyone else said I was crazy. You graded papers all night and never, ever missed one of my competitions. You are the most formidable spirit I have ever known. Tell them about me, not the sad parts. Tell them I loved vintage cookbooks and terrible action movies, and that I always oversalted the first test batch of any new soup. Tell them I miss them with every breath. I miss them. I love you, Mom. Now go be their grandmother, and their mother, and their whole world. Your Alara. Margaret held the printed pages on her lap, the crisp paper cold against her fingers. Her daughter had formatted the text like one of her elegant menus, the chef in her demanding perfect presentation, even in her last goodbye. She put the letter into the purse beside the encrypted drive, next to her wallet, beside a small collection of poems. She would keep it with her always, not out of fear of forgetting, but because it was the nearest she could get to the feeling of her daughter's hand in hers. She got to her feet. She threw cold water on her face from the stainless steel sink in the catering kitchen. She wiped it on the sleeve of her blazer. In the reflective surface of a wine fridge, she caught a glimpse of herself. Dark hair, Alara's hair. She returned to the rooftop patio that looked out over the city. She paused there for a second. The breeze from Lake Michigan rustled the tall grasses and the planters. A hawk circled somewhere high above the towers, a brown silhouette against a bruised purple sky. "You saved them, Alara," Margaret whispered. "From all the way up here, you saved your own children." She slid her hand along the balcony railing, the metal cool in the evening air. She let her hand linger there for a moment, then turned toward the elevator. Arthur was waiting on the ground floor. Sophie was waiting. The twins were in the sedan with the new nanny, a woman named Helen, 58 years old, a retired nurse recommended by a friend. Kind eyes, a steady presence. Finn had fallen asleep on Helen's shoulder within 5 minutes of meeting her. Margaret slipped into the back seat. She clicked her seatbelt into place. She looked at the 2 car seats, 2 tiny faces. Leo was beginning to stir, his eyelids fluttering, deep brown eyes staring right at him. Arthur felt a smile spread across his face for the first time in what seemed like an eternity. It wasn't the brave face he put on for visitors. It was real. He gave the cabbie a nod. The car merged into the evening traffic of Back Bay. The lights of the shops along Newberry Street cast a warm glow on the brick facades, defiant and full of life. 6 months on, the Beacon Hill townhouse felt entirely different. Not through any grand renovation, but in the subtle way a landscape shifts with the light, a slow, profound change. The bones of the house were the same, but a new current of life flowed through it. Arthur had transformed Clara's architectural studio into the nursery, painting the walls a soft forest green, the color she always used in her renderings of woodland retreats. He kept her vast drafting table and her floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, but the room was now gentle and warm, the color of a fresh start. He had carefully framed and rehung all of Clara's design awards in the main hall. The Pritzker mention, the industry accolades, the magazine features. Next to them, he'd started a new collection. Photos of the twins at 1 day, 1 week, and 1 month old. A new legacy taking root beside the old. The sound of Maya's first gurgle, the sight of Leo's first tooth, the way he would reach for a wooden block with the unwavering concentration of a watchmaker. Clara's design journals, which had been stored in the study, were open once more. Arthur spent his evenings poring over them. He knew little about biophilic design. Clara had been the visionary, the artist who could weave nature into the very fabric of a building. But he was determined to learn. He read her notebooks, filled with her elegant, precise script, detailing the properties of sustainable timber, the flow of natural light, and the perfect angle for a cantilevered balcony to catch the morning sun. A complex sketch for a self-sustaining urban vertical farm remained on a large whiteboard. Arthur viewed it as a sacred manuscript. Julian pleaded guilty to insider trading after a swift investigation by the SEC. His legal team negotiated a sentence of 3 years in a minimum security facility, along with financial penalties that liquidated his entire fortune and a lifetime ban from the financial sector. His hedge fund was dissolved, its assets seized. The board of the city's art museum requested his immediate resignation. His name, once celebrated in financial journals and at economic forums, now only existed in court filings and articles chronicling his spectacular implosion. Eleanor Thorne, Julian's mother, stopped taking his collect calls from prison. It wasn't out of any sympathy for Clara or a sudden strike of conscience, but because the scandal had irrevocably tainted the family name. Eleanor guarded her social position like a hawk guards its nest. It was vital, absolute. Her son had turned the Thorne legacy into a disgrace. Amelia simply disappeared. The sleek waterfront condo Julian had been leasing for her was repossessed during the asset seizure. The last anyone heard, she had moved out to Portland seeking a new beginning, or at least a different coast. She sent Arthur a single handwritten letter 2 months after the sentencing. It said, "I am deeply sorry for the role I played. I know that means nothing now." Arthur read the words. He never wrote back, but he didn't throw the letter away. He placed it in a drawer, a small paper artifact, a testament to the complexities of human failure, a reminder that the woman who helped shatter his daughter's world was also the one whose anonymous tip had secured his grandchildren's future. Dr. Anya Sharma, a pediatrician with an old-fashioned practice, became a fixture in their lives. She visited every other Thursday, always bringing a box of cannoli from a bakery in the North End and a small, soft-bound book for each twin. She would check their weight and their reflexes and ask Arthur about their sleeping patterns and their appetites. But then she would always stay for tea. She would sit at the large kitchen island and chat with Arthur about things entirely unrelated to pediatrics. About the Red Sox, about a new documentary on urban planning she had watched, about her own father, who had passed away 2 years prior and whose old jokes she still repeated every day. They formed an unexpected team, a quiet partnership, a 70-year-old retired historian and a 55-year-old physician, united by the memory of the woman they both felt they had let down, and by a silent vow they were both determined to uphold. Evelyn showed up every Sunday, a ritual she refused to break. She would arrive at 11 a.m. with 2 large coffees from a small cafe in Cambridge, where she and Clara used to spend hours sketching out ideas on napkins. She always brought 2 kinds, a dark roast for Arthur and a cinnamon latte with oat milk, because Clara had once sworn it was the key to creative genius. After their coffee, Evelyn would sketch for the twins. She had a whole repertoire of fantastic creatures, a dragon with butterfly wings, a whale that swam through clouds. Leo would squeal with delight every time, a sudden bright burst of sound that seemed to surprise even him, a small, perfect moment of pure joy. "Your mom was a master at this," Evelyn told the babies one afternoon, balancing Maya on her knee as the baby gummed the edge of a large sketch pad. She could see a whole world in an empty space. "I can't do that, but I'll keep drawing these silly monsters for you." Marcus, for his part, built something new in the spare room of his South End loft. For a month of nights, it became his sole focus. He would get home from his firm and work until the first light crept over the harbor. He used cutting-edge processors and virtual reality engines, building on a set of programming frameworks that a former colleague had developed. He enclosed the entire system in a clean, minimalist server cabinet, powder-coated in a deep cerulean blue, the second color Clara had loved most, after the green of new leaves. The project wasn't for the babies, not right away. At 6 months old, they were still mastering the art of sitting up. It was for who they would become, for when they were 6 and 10 and 16, for the days they would want to see what their mother had built, a place where they could walk through her designs, feel her vision, and get closer to the brilliant woman they would never have the chance to know. On the server's access panel, he attached a small brushed steel plate engraved with 3 words, "The Clara Continuum." She played it for him on a cool autumn evening. Robert stood by the grand piano in the living room, looking out at the city lights of San Francisco. The melody was a stunning, bittersweet contrast to the fog rolling in over the bay, its hopeful high notes catching the last of the twilight. "He would have been so proud of this," Robert whispered, his voice catching. "He would have said I rushed the crescendo in the 3rd movement," Lena replied with a watery smile. And Robert let out a chuckle, a real, unforced sound that seemed to rise from a place he thought had been locked away forever. It was a noise he never imagined he would make again, yet there it was, unexpected and warm, evidence that joy could find its way into the most profound sorrow. In the quiet of the nights, after Chloe was asleep and a hush fell over the house, Robert would sit in the nursery. He had placed the rocking chair in the perfect position, right in the middle of the room, just near enough to the crib to watch the gentle rhythm of his granddaughter's breathing. The chair was an old one Alex had found in a vintage shop. He had spent a month sanding and refinishing the dark wood himself, a labor of love. Lena had upholstered the cushion in a soft gray wool that still smelled faintly of the lavender sachets she tucked into all the closets. Robert would rock, the chair's steady, even cadence a comfort, the sound of something constant and true in the stillness. He would look at the crib, at the custom-made mobile of hand-carved wooden musical notes that turned slowly above her, and at the nightlight that projected a soft, shifting pattern resembling a musical staff onto the ceiling, bathing the room in a gentle amber light. Alex had designed both pieces, and a luthier friend of his had crafted them from reclaimed maple wood. The boxes had arrived a week after the funeral. Robert had assembled them himself, his hands unsteady. Chloe always slept on her side, a trait she shared with her father. The moment she was laid down, she would curl into a comfortable position and stay there, perfectly still. That peaceful self-possession, Robert saw it in her right away. It was pure Alex through and through. She slept soundly, her tiny fists resting near her cheeks as if conducting a silent orchestra. Her eyelids would sometimes twitch as she dreamed. At only 4 months old, Robert wondered what her brand new mind was composing. Sensations, probably. The comfort of being held, the taste of warm milk, the loving murmur of a voice in her ear. She was the calmer of the 2 of them, the more contemplative. She waited for her bottle. She waited for her blankets to be tucked in. She waited for the distant sound of the cable car to fade, and only then would she make her own small sound. It was never a cry, not a complaint, but a single clear note. I am here. I am listening. Diane was in the rocking chair, her eyes on the steady rise and fall of their chests. Two flawless little humans brought into the world by medical technology and a mother's unyielding determination. They were the product of a woman's powerful refusal to believe that the family she had always imagined was out of reach. She knew how the media would frame the story: a tech titan, a cheating husband, and a quiet betrayal that became the gossip of Boston's venture capital scene. A life cut short far too early. But that narrative completely missed the heart of the matter. The real story was about a mother who loved her children with such astonishing foresight that she constructed a digital fortress for them before the first battle had even begun. A woman who uncovered encrypted financial records, secured private data servers, rewrote the bylaws of her own company, and drafted an unbreakable trust. She methodically planned for the absolute worst-case scenario while, at the same time, she was choosing paint colors for the nursery and humming to the two small heartbeats she carried inside her. The true story was about a mother who fought her final war in complete silence and secured her victory from beyond the grave. Diane rose and walked to the window, gazing out at the city lights twinkling over the harbor. The stark, modern statue in the courtyard was a black silhouette against the illuminated stone wall of the townhome. The tiny garden itself was dormant for the winter. She picked up the old brass compass from the windowsill. She had discovered it in a box from Isabel's study, the very one Isabel had kept next to her computer, its needle perfectly still, its face glowing faintly in the dark. A reminder of true north. Diane lifted the glass lid. On the smooth, slate-colored wall above Julian's crib, she used her finger to trace the shape of a small, faint star. She did the same thing above Clara's. Two tiny, invisible marks. A grandmother's touch could never have the same certainty as a mother's, but the intent was the same, a constant prayer whispered onto the calm gray walls. She closed the compass and placed it back on the sill. She would leave it there until the day the twins were old enough to grasp its significance, for the day they were ready to chart their own course. A glance at the clock, 11:45. A new day was moments away. She knew she needed to rest, to save her energy. She had two 6-month-old babies who would be up at 5:30, wanting bottles and comfort and every bit of love she possessed. And she would provide it. All of it. Every morning, every evening, every feeding, every diaper, every bath, every song, every scraped knee, every first word, every nightmare. She would give them everything because it was the legacy Clara had entrusted to her, and because it was simply who Eleanor was, who she had always been, who she would remain until her final day. She began to sing softly, a simple folk lullaby Clara had cherished, the same one Eleanor's grandmother had sung to her while rocking on a porch swing decades ago, a tune that wove 3 generations of women together. No complicated words, just the melody of pure devotion traveling through the years. The boys slept on. The faint light from 2 small star-shaped projectors cast a gentle silver glow on the ceiling. The cottage was still. Outside, the first true stars began to glitter above the old oak tree, with its gnarled branches and its quiet promise of future climbs and shared secrets and a happiness that was only just a sapling, but one destined to grow. In its own time. Her world now came in pairs. 2 tiny mouths to nourish, 2 paths to guide, 2 hearts now beating in the world because Clara's was not. And Eleanor, at 65 years old, with her salt and pepper hair and her tired smile, felt more vibrantly, deeply, and stubbornly alive than ever before. She wouldn't trade a single moment of it, not for all the treasures in this world or any other. This narrative carries a single powerful truth that nothing can diminish. Love does not cease when a life is over. The love of a mother weaves a legacy that will always endure. It leaves behind a blueprint to guide her children long after she's departed. It shields the family she can no longer hold in her arms. If this story resonated with you, if it sparked a genuine emotion, we invite you to do one small thing. Hit the thumbs up button. Drop a comment below and let us know which part of the journey touched you the most. Share this video with someone who might need a reminder of their own enduring strength. And for our new viewers, please consider subscribing and ringing the notification bell so you won't miss our next story. Your support is the very reason we can continue our work. Each like, every comment, and every share provides the motivation for us to keep creating, to keep sharing narratives that matter, tales that linger in your thoughts long after the screen goes dark. Thank you for journeying with us to the very end. You are why we do this. This content was carefully researched, written, and manually edited by our dedicated team to provide you with inspiring stories and valuable insights. All characters and situations are fictional, crafted for the purpose of entertainment and reflection.